I hope you like GR Corolla content because this is about to be a very long video on this car. We're hoping that this video is going to serve two different purposes. First off, maybe more entertainingly, this is going to be a high versus low shootout. We're taking two identical GR Corolla circuits, the car behind me and another 2023 car, and showing what you can do on the track and on the street with two different performance budgets. The car behind us is our high car. It's essentially a $65,000 Corolla. And the other vehicle has a little under $5,000 to $10,000 worth of modifications, trying not to screw up what makes these cars so great, and that is their multi-purpose capability. The other thing we're going to be doing in this video is essentially creating an aftermarket guide to this car. You're going to be hearing from a bunch of different functional experts. From Graham, the biggest engine tuner of the GR Corolla platform, arguably. You're going to be hearing from Ben, the owner of Limit Plus One, one of the biggest shops who sells and builds GR Corolla parts and makes customer cars go fast. He's done everything you could possibly imagine with this car, and he's going to walk you through where this platform's at, some of the pros and cons of it, and of course, what these cars are like to work on. And you're also going to be hearing from Grant from Annex Suspension, who's going to walk you through the pros and cons of the chassis of this car, along with his engineering philosophy, and of course, Wyatt from MCS Suspension. The other thing is, what about our experience with our own car so far? So as a recap, we own a 2023 GR Corolla circuit. It now has over 8,000 miles. For most of its life, it's been mostly stock, minus a set of Apex wheels and brake pads from Counter Space Garage, and of course, Potenza race tires. The car has been mostly pretty reliable. There are the typical GR Corolla issues, which we've talked about so far, like weak front bumper clips to just weak bumpers. The car has developed the Subaru smell, meaning gear oil smell, which no one seems to be able to find or address. I've just learned to live with it, but the car itself has been very reliable. Your mileage will vary with this product. Most of the people I've known who own this car don't have any problems, and that's largely due to their relationship with their dealer and luck of the draw. Fuel economy in this car has been low 20s, depending on how you look at it, either a huge disappointment or exactly what you should be expecting for a car that makes, I don't know, 200-300 horsepower and is all-wheel drive. But with all that said, and that housekeeping out of the way, so I'm gonna put this car up on the lift and briefly walk you through the high versus low builds before we head to the track, have Britt involved, talk to all the experts and everything else you're gonna see in this video. So what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we're trying to show you what you can do with two different budgets. A lower budget and essentially a unlimited budget. We wanted to build the best GR Corolla possible. Something that maintains the good points of the car, meaning a daily driver that you can take to the track. We wanted to improve ride quality. We wanted to improve limit handling and the way the cars actually felt behind the wheel. Driving, while we are going to demonstrate lap times, is more than just numbers. It's about how comfortable you feel at the limit. Now for this test, we did keep some variables constant between both of these cars. Again, going back to the fact that we wanted to build the best cars possible. When it comes to engine performance, both of these cars get the identical power output. They both are tuned by Graham, who you're gonna hear from later. They both have a 93 octane tune. They both have an Eventuri intake, which you're gonna hear from him on why that is the case. And both of them have exhaust for the track portion of this video. The low car gets an MBRP exhaust. The high car gets an AWE touring exhaust. Both improve the volume levels of this car, but both are quite loud. I will say the GR Corolla has an acquired taste when it comes to engine tone, though both do visually look better than the stock exhaust, but I'm gonna be honest, neither of them add really any vast amounts of power. The other thing that's constant between both of these cars is they both have SPL rear camber arms. The reason for that is the GR Corolla has essentially no camber adjustability whatsoever, and that's the only way we could adjust the rear. And they're both on Potenza race tires, however in different sizes, and we're going to explain why here in a second. So let's start with the high car. It is a 2023 GR Corolla Circuit. It has about 8,000 miles. In this video, you'll see it in two different shades of green. One was a vinyl wrap, one was a PPF color change wrap. Doesn't really change anything about the car. The low car is also a 2023 Circuit, which means, again, both cars get the differentials and the carbon fiber roof, and the low car is white. For the high car, the primary changes are all in suspension, as you're going to clearly tell very quickly in this video. Starting with the coilover setup. In the high car, we are running the MCS Limit Plus One single adjustable road-based kit. You'll see the skew in the bottom. It's running an 8K front, 10K rear spring rate, and it gets camber plates. It is arguably the more aggressive of the two setups. It's definitely skewed a little bit towards more the track usage case of these dampers. While this generates a little bit more NVH than the Annex kit for sure, and doesn't ride quite as well, it does have quite a bit of track capability. The other thing to talk about is the big brake kit. This is running the AP S6 big brake kit. This is the Radical kit, has the EMP finish. I'm going to flat out say this. It is the best aftermarket brake kit on the market. The Radical setup is incredible. They work very, very hard on properly sizing these kits. For the master cylinders, they spend countless hours, the R&D side of things. You basically get no compromises other than NVH. It doesn't weigh anymore despite being far bigger. It has higher thermal capacity. It doesn't have pedal knockback issues. It has incredible pedal feel. It is just the one con, expensive and noisy. And that again is the compromise we're going with this. The other thing to talk about are the wheels. The high car gets Apex wheels. These are the SM10RSs. They're forged. They essentially weigh the same as the factory wheels despite being wider. And they are running a 265 tire. It is a very wide tire, and thankfully they don't rub. The con of the GR Corolla, which you can hear about probably later in this video, is if you run an aftermarket wheel, you essentially have to add $1,000 to the price tag, particularly if you're not doing your own maintenance or you're doing your own parts. Because to run an aftermarket wheel in this car, you have to run extended studs, which is expensive. These are running the ARP studs, and it's the only way that's going to work. And for the low car, we're running the Annex Fast Roads. This is a slightly different setup they designed for this video. This is an inverted monotube. Their philosophy for this is flat handling with good ride compliance. For the money, we feel is the best coilover kit you can buy. On purpose, because this is a more road-focused kit, we wanted to demonstrate what was possible, so we're not running camber plates. In fact, we're running camber bolts, so you don't have any of the NVH issues that come from the MCS. For brakes, we're keeping the stock calipers. Obviously, we're running a higher temp brake fluid, but we're running counter space garage pads. As you're going to see, they are still more than capable enough to do what we're doing in this video. The AP kit is also running counter space garage pads. We're running the factory wheel for the reasons we just mentioned with a narrower Potenza race tire. To test both of these setups, you're going to see a street drive that I'm going to do solo, and then we're going to talk to Britt after he's lapped both of these cars. But before we do any of that, let's talk to a series of functional experts. We're here at Limit Plus One with Ben, the owner of Limit Plus One. He's been the man behind the curtain for a lot of these videos, and without them, this video series would not be possible. Just like we've done in the past with James, I wanted to talk to Ben about where the market is as far as modification, what you've learned about these cars. You have a gajillion customer cars at this point, doing everything from sequential builds to regular engine tunes, everything in between. You've seen it all, you've raced these cars. Let's talk about what's gone wrong, what goes wrong with these cars, engine costs, what you've seen so far since the last time we've talked.
Yeah, first, Jack, thanks so much for having me on.
Of course.
I think you gave me too much credit there, but that's okay. So all-wheel drive has been talked about a lot with that overheating. Obviously, you've experienced it a bunch. How many laps are you seeing until it overheats?
Around Autobahn South with someone who's going pretty quick. So myself or Britt or Mark or yourself, it's like 2-3 laps of going flat out. The car goes into front-wheel drive mode.
Yeah, same thing. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes of use.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, kind of a bummer. But it doesn't necessarily ruin the car, right? You can still get around it by doing a cool down lap, in between, or not even a cool down lap. You have to cycle the ignition. So pull into pits, turn the car on and off, and then you get another couple laps out of it. There's been a ton of different variants of trying to fix this issue. It kind of started off with wrapping the exhaust. The theory was that exhaust was transferring heat into the rear clutch pack and the pinion side of the differential. That was proven to be false. We tested that well over a year ago now, and had just no change whatsoever. It didn't last any longer. And there's been a ton of iteration since then of trying to solve this issue. We even worked with Varus Engineering on building a aftermarket housing for the rear clutch pack that basically has a large reservoir underneath with 2 ports that allow for cooling as well. You could then run the fluid through a cooler and back in to hopefully resolve the issue. Found out that doesn't work either. So not ideal.
Why doesn't it work, I guess is my question.
So there's a temp sensor on this housing, and it actually doesn't really read anything. It might put a value into the computer somewhere, but that is not the value that the computer is using to open up the clutch pack. It's actually a calculated value.
What do you mean to open up? He means turn off the all-wheel drive system.
Turn off all-wheel drive, yeah, and basically put it in a limp mode or front-wheel drive mode after those couple laps. So yeah, this value that we're seeing at the temp sensor on this housing, isn't used at all from what we can tell. And believe it or not, once you take it apart, it doesn't actually sit in fluid, so it only sits in open air. It's probably not the most reliable reading anyways. The design of the sensor looks like it would be a sensor that would sit in fluid, but it's just not the case. So I'm not really sure what it's reading exactly, and that value is being used somewhere, but definitely not for opening up this clutch pack and basically putting the car in front-wheel drive mode.
And you've gone further than that. In between all of our various tests, Ben disconnected my trans temp sensor, which is the other sensor we were looking at, and the diff sensor. We ran a different sensors that sat in open ambient air.
Correct.
And still after 2-ish laps, it went into front wheel drive.
The same amount of time. Yeah, we like you just said, we had those sensors in open air under the vehicle, picking up fresh air the entire time, and no change whatsoever. And there's no other temp sensor that could be causing this necessarily in the drivetrain. So between transmission, transfer case, and differential, there's only the 2 sensors that it could possibly be, neither of which are causing the clutch pack to open up.
So it's a software issue that hopefully Aftermarket Tuning, we're going to talk to Graham about that a little later, will address. That is sort of the big elephant in the room with this car.
Correct.
I guess the other thing we want to talk about is some of your solutions to oil cooling and radiator temps.
Yep. Oil cooling's pretty basic. It's just the old-fashioned way of doing it. Add a sandwich plate, add a cooler, and we're seeing about a 25-degree drop in oil temps. I think we were running 2 cars on the exact same day at Autobahn, and we saw about a 25-degree difference in oil temps. And adding that oil cooler did not play a negative factor in coolant temp either. A lot of times when you add an oil cooler, stacking that in front of a radiator can raise coolant temp. But we were actually seeing a 5-degree decrease in coolant temp, as well as a 25 decrease in temperature for oil temp.
And this is there are various kits, but you guys have designed your own in-house one that we're running in my car.
Yeah, correct. All C-Treb components, super high-end stuff, kind of the standard in the motorsports industry.
The one thing I will say as well is if you are driving this car reasonably hard, you probably won't run into the oil temp issues, but once you start tuning this car, or driving it fairly hard, both the low car and the high car were running the same engine tune, and after, 4 laps, you were getting 250, 260 on my car, and you were basically overheating the oil in the other vehicle.
Yeah, me driving at Road America last year with no oil cooler, I even crept up towards 300-degree oil. Coming from racing BMWs in the past, that's a very common thing. I mean, I've run endurance races sitting at 300 degrees the entire race, but it's not a turbocharged application, and we'd like to see definitely cooler temps. Yeah, well, just for peace of mind.
Yeah, and that car runs like an OW20 or OW16.
Yeah, which I don't recommend for track use. If it's a heavily tracked car, 540 all day. Even heavier sometimes. But 540 is a good middle point. If it's just a spirited driving car, you're going to beat it up on the weekends through some back roads. 540 is a good option for that.
You have also seen what it's like to deal with when these cars lose an engine, which is very rare.
Yep.
The one you dealt with, or the couple that you've dealt with, have all been either user error, money shifting a car, and
that car ended up here. The dealership wrote a massive quote for it. I think it was nearly $40,000. It was definitely in the 30s, if I recall, which is crazy. But unfortunately, that's just the cost of Toyota parts right now. This engine, I think they priced it at about $16,000, which is wild.
You see, long term, you foresee that price coming down, though.
Of course, yeah. I think it's a supply and demand right now. But you know, we can get a bare short block, I think, for about the $6,000 range. So that's the whole rotating assembly in the bottom end. From there, the additional cylinder head is that extra cost. And just the turbo itself too. If you have a blown up engine, you have to replace the turbo due to metal contamination. That's $5,000 from Toyota. So it just adds up, you know.
But the failures are all either user related or pushing the car to a point where you're making far more horsepower than you probably should out of a 3-cylinder with factory internals.
Yeah, it seems fully reliable. Unless you just put it in the wrong gear at 120 miles an hour. You can't.
Which would happen to any manual car.
Exactly, yeah. Any manual car at all. It's not a GR Corolla specific issue, obviously. You know, you could do it on a new M2 even, and I guarantee the repair bill for that will be more than the Corolla.
You have dealt with thousands of customers at this point with this vehicle, and my sorry ass, trying to make this car or both of these cars better than they are.
Yeah.
Where is the market now when it comes to modifications and parts availability versus when I started this almost a year ago now?
Well, obviously it's developed fully, almost. You know, we've discovered the limits of a stock engine, that being valve springs. We've got a couple engine builds here in-house where we can solve that issue and then reliably make 400 horsepower. So I think most of the bases are covered. We're still waiting for a lot of manufacturers to actually release the parts they've developed, but there is an option to do almost anything you want with this car. So the aftermarket's kind of come to fruition, and you know, we can basically tune a stock car now, make 315 wheel horsepower and 93 octane all day long. It's reliable, drivability is great. There's now awesome features like I think Graham's going to talk about, launch control, flat foot shifting, stuff like that. So this car has developed more than I ever thought it would have. And once this problem is solved with the rear clutch pack in the pinion half of the differential, this is going to be really brought to the next level. And I think it's really just up to Ecutech to figure out the coding for it. And hopefully it's as easy one day as checking a box while tuning, and now your problem is solved. So I think that's what it's going to come down to. It's only a matter of time.
So this is our engine tuning portion of our video. I'm here with Graham. Graham, you are the in-house tuner here for Limit Plus One. Obviously you work with Ultima Raceworks, you work at Paragon, you tune Subarus. I've known Graham longer than Savage Geese has existed. You tuned one of my WRXs, and you did Phase Garage's RSTI, if you've watched that video.
Yeah. We go back a long ways.
Yes, we do, which is,
when you came in here and you said hello to me, and you're like, remember me? I'm like, yeah. And then Ben's like, that's Savage Geese. I'm like, no way. No way. I feel awful right now. I did not know this connection existed, but it's super cool.
No, this is it's a very small world, apparently.
It turns out it is.
So let's talk about what you can do with this car so far. You are sort of the de facto tuner for the GR Corolla. Where does this car sit as far as what you can do with the ECU, what you can change? What are the parameters you're working with so far?
Sure. So we are using Ecutech Technologies tuning to do the tuning on these cars. They picked this car up right away. They have a Yaris over there, but as you know, the Yaris and the GR Yaris, GR Corolla have a lot of parity. Our cars have a few little differences for the US, but for the most part, all the development work they're doing on their in-house Yaris applies to these cars. So they hit it really hard from the beginning. We got right on the beta program with them. I've been one of their beta tuners for a very long time for other platforms, so we had some early access to it. And yeah, we dove right in. We did a lot of testing with them, and we're still ongoing testing. But at this point, we have a ton of control over the engine. It's an extremely complex ECU in here and tuning, one of the most complex I've ever seen for like a production Japanese car, you know, kind of almost on par with Audi, Volkswagen, and how they do things. But Ecutech has done a really good job of mapping out all the important stuff to the point where on a stock turbo, you can do full bolt-ons, we can do ethanol tuning, so we have really good engine control at this point.
What are the added complexities, Graham? If you know Graham, it's probably from your Subaru or your Corvette stuff.
Yeah.
What is the added complexity that the ECU and the Corolla has over, say, a regular car?
Sure. Best way I can compare it, especially if we're talking in the Japanese realm of cars, because as I've done tuning, I've done every type of platform. American cars kind of have a style that they follow, and German cars have a style that they follow, and Japanese cars have always kind of had a style that they follow. So as far as Japanese cars go, and Subarus that I've done 5,000 plus of, they're very straightforward. It's just, for example, let's just talk about a turbo car and boost.
Yep.
If you want to achieve a target boost, there's just simply a target table. Okay, you type in a bigger target, you go to the wastegate control table, you use more wastegate control, boom, you've got more boost. It's that simple. On these cars, and a lot of German style cars, they call them torque based. So it all starts with your pedal, goes to a driver demand, goes to a theoretical torque to the engine, and that goes to an airflow that you're looking for, and the airflow is met with boost. So the boost is indirectly targeted through your pedal. So it's a very complex mapping that you have to understand all the way to get to that target boost point.
Are you actively changing timing at the same time, and how are you mapping that with keeping a linear pedal as well?
So right now, honestly, the stock pedal mapping on this car is phenomenal. There's really not much reason to change it. It has 3 drive modes, the Eco. You probably notice Eco kind of takes a little bit off. The normal daily driving, the normal mode, is really smooth and very linear, and then Sport gets kind of touchy. And Sport's awesome when you're on the track. That's what you want. So honestly, I haven't had any desire or need to touch those modes, even though we have access to them.
So when it comes to the actual performance of the car, before we get into some of the finer details, what have you seen as far as the numbers? Obviously, you've tuned both of the cars in our series, and I think they're making high 200s, and that's off a 93 octane tune with an intake, and that's it. Where are sort of the levels of power, and where do you start to see the limitations of both the cooling as well as the fuel?
Sure. So base power-wise, they're usually about 260 in that realm. If we do to the wheels, 260 to the wheels. If we do an intake and a tune, we can generally get that up closer to 300, especially if you're adding a downpipe to it. That helps it breathe a little bit better too. Intercooler will help get those charge temps down. So we can start to kind of approach the low 300s as we talk about putting ethanol in, and we do like an E50 blend tune right now, and that will get you up into the middle 300s. My car with just an intake exhaust intercooler, and that's a catted exhaust, on this dyno produced 340 at the wheels.
When it comes to intakes, obviously we've added an Eventuri to both vehicles. Why, and do they actually work? So
from my testing, we tested the Eventuri very specifically on the dyno. On the low end, it really didn't do a whole lot for the car, but that's not too surprising with a turbo car. They don't really need that much extra, air volume down low. But on the top end, we did see some performance gains. Some of it was, it will sometimes create some more boost pressure, which can create more power, kind of be sort of a false negative of is it doing anything. But genuinely, when we tested it and we saw exactly the same boost levels, same timing, same fueling, there was extra power there. The thing that I looked at on the data, this car has a turbo inlet pressure sensor. So it actually knows how much vacuum is being created after the air filter. And I could see that there was less restriction, in other words, less vacuum, a lot closer to ambient pressure with the Eventuri intake. And most other intakes show that same thing. So the stock airbox at high RPM, at higher boost levels, does create a bit of a restriction. So aftermarket intakes, including Eventuri, reduce that and get more airflow into the engine.
And that's not always the case for most cars these days, to be entirely
honest. Not always. Yeah, a lot of times intakes, especially naturally aspirated cars,
don't do anything.
Yeah, they do almost nothing. But turbo cars, a lot of times, can benefit from, even just filter element changes. Sometimes, a race air filter in a turbo car can make a difference because, again, you're reducing those inlet pressure drop essentially.
And the downpipe is just helping with flow.
Downpipe is helping get the exhaust out. Exactly. Back pressure. An engine is a pump, right? It's pumping the air through essentially. And if you can pump it out a lot easier, then you're going to have more actual power getting to the wheels and not going through your pumping losses.
Where do you see limitations? Is it cooling primarily? Is it inlet temps? And what is sort of stopping you to make more power?
So if we're talking on the street,
yes,
there's really no limitations on the street. You can drive these cars pretty hard. Now maybe if you're on some like back roads where you can really give it the beans for a long time, you might drive your oil temps up. But on the street, honestly, you really can't overheat these cars that I've seen. If you're really staying in it, you might see some high intercooler charge temps. It'll pull some power back. The biggest limitation, honestly, is the valve flow. I don't know how much you've talked about that on your series yet, but
we've left this for you, sir.
So anybody that knows about these cars, there's two big things. There's the front-wheel drive mode, of course.
Which we've talked about a lot.
You guys have covered that. So the valve float is my department. So basically the valve float's the biggest thing we have to watch out for. If we try to raise the boost pressure at higher RPMs.
Where are you peaking? Where's boost peak now currently for the car?
So boost peaks about 3,400 RPMs to 30.
And what PSI?
Depending on the fuel, 28 up to 30. Yeah. So
Jesus.
And to give you so Toyota tuned in. Well, quick sidebar. We'll come back to valve float. Toyota tuned in a really flat torque curve on these cars. Potentially just for longevity, for drivability, for whatever reason. If you look at the boost curve on these, it's really interesting. At about 3,000, they start off near 18 to 20. And by 5,400, they actually ramp to 25. So that it takes this climb to 25, then they drop straight down to about 17 or 18 by red line to kind of, again, create this flat torque. When we get in and tune these, a lot of the power that we're adding is in the mid-range. We can run that boost up quite a bit farther in the mid-range. On my car on E50, by 4,000 RPMs, I'm at 28, 29 PSI. And so it has significantly more torque than it does, we're talking 260 torque up to about 350 torque on mine. And that's kind of my my track spec too. And there's more if you really pushed it, but I'm trying to be nice to the engine, let it last. So,
for obvious reasons?
For obvious reasons, they're kind of expensive. So, but yeah, we can put a lot more boost in the mid-range, even on pump gas, and the punch of these cars is significantly different, as you felt.
Where are you feeling, so when's the valve float coming in? What horsepower figure, what boost?
Valve float is high RPM. It's above 65. And because valve float is coming from basically the exhaust valves not being able to close. And the reason why exhaust valves can't close is there's too much exhaust back pressure working against them. So you're trying to pump the exhaust into the manifold, but if there's too much pressure in there and the valve springs are not strong enough, it's keeping the valves open. So the problem there, again, is just simply soft valve springs. Now, to some degree, if you just put valve springs in it and hammer it with a ton of boost up there, the back pressure is still there. You're still making the engine work harder. It's not necessarily good just to put valve springs in and then go willy-nilly on boost. You still have to respect the turbocharger efficiency limits.
What's that power figure? At what point are you basically forcing the car to have that valve float problem? Is it 400 wheel, 500 wheel?
Well, that's the thing. It's nothing to do with power. You can put a bigger turbocharger on here and keep your back pressure within the limits of the stock valve springs. And you put a big enough turbo on there, you might be able to make 500 before you get valve float. So it's not a power thing. It's a turbo efficiency. These turbos are kind of small that come on this car because it's a tiny little engine trying to spool it up.
So with the stock turbo, then, where are you getting that number? Is there a...
What boost level?
Yeah, what boost level?
Boost level.
Sorry, what boost level are you getting?
Right, so typically from my experience, and kind of mod dependent, 22, 23 PSI, if you're trying to carry more than that. I went chasing valve float on my car on purpose, both on pump gas and E85. And I found it by 25 on my car, sometimes 26. Also depends on ambient air conditions. So I had it to a point where I thought I was safe, and I tuned it here on the dyno in warmer weather. I went to Mid-Ohio 1 year ago with that map. First session out, instant valve flow at the same boost pressure because it was quite a bit cooler morning, denser air. So as I've tested this car, I've learned that there's a lot of variables and you need a pretty big cushion. And then in ethanol, you would think maybe with ethanol you can run more boost pressure, right? And get away with not seeing valve flow. Other way around.
Interesting.
We actually have to be a bit more careful with ethanol because ethanol is amazing. It's an amazing fuel. It makes more power, but it uses a lot more fuel to do it, which means more exhaust density.
Gas,
and when you're putting more exhaust density into your manifold, your exhaust back pressure gets higher sooner.
So that's basically a parameter, though. If you wanted to just keep most of your internal parts stock turbo, stock valve springs, you could tune around that issue theoretically.
You can, yes. So when we tune these cars, we make sure that upper RPM boost pressure stays well under the valve float limits, no matter what the mods, no matter what the fuel, and we don't have any issues with it. We also warn people what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, so they can let us know, hey, my car's, it's like an artificial rev limiter coming in earlier than you expect.
So in our case, when we ran this car, it was worst case scenario for both vehicles. So like 108 real feel. Neither of those cars felt like they're making peak power for obvious reasons. When do you start noticing timing getting pulled, and how can you get around that in these cars?
So that's a temperature component. Yes. So there's oil temperature can pull timing, coolant temperature can pull timing, and also your charge air temperature can pull timing. And that's probably what you were running into, was because you guys are factory intercoolers on those cars. Factory intercoolers, after a couple laps, the charge temperatures start getting pretty high. And when those are high enough, that'll create more knock. So we have to pull back timing and pull back boost. So at what point does that happen? Typically about 120 to 130 is when we kind of start getting a little bit of timing reduction, and if it starts getting past 140 to 150 or 160, if it gets that high, we got to get pretty aggressive. On pump gas fuels, that can knock pretty easy.
But if you move to an ethanol tune, you can get around that a little bit.
Absolutely. So we recalibrate all those timing compensation tables for ethanol. You don't want to zero them out. A lot of tuners will think, oh, ethanol's invincible, it can't ever knock, but we can reduce it quite a bit. So through my testing, like when I'm out at the track in like mid-Ohio last weekend, I'm playing with that and kind of watching it, seeing how things look. Sometimes pull the plugs, read the plugs, see how they look. And we can reduce those compensations so that ethanol, even as your charge temperatures might be the same as on your pump gas tune, we don't need to pull as much timing and the car will still run happy and safe.
I'm at Limit Plus One with Grant from Annex Suspension. Grant gets to be yet another half-Asian technical expert I interview on this channel. Grant, please introduce yourself to the boys and girls at home.
Hey guys, I'm Grant Hendricks. I'm the founder and product manager at Annex Suspension, and also half-Asian.
All right, so Grant, you guys are a small company. As Grant and I have been talking for months about this project, as you've kindly helped us develop I hate to say the road and track alternative to a damper kit. It's not purely street, it's not purely track, it's for someone who's looking for that weekend warrior approach and they don't want to sacrifice ride quality. Tell me about, or tell them, because I know about it, but tell them about sort of Annex's story. How did you guys start and how do you guys place yourself in the segment? Because as you and I have talked about, you have cheap, shitty Chinese eBay coilovers already for this car, and then you have very, very price prohibitive dampers as well. You guys are trying to sit in the middle of price, but obviously deliver all the quality you could possibly ask for.
I mean, that's worth mentioning because there's like a ton of options out there. Like the suspension market itself is extremely saturated. So why do we get into this, right? So I had the idea around 2016, 2017, but basically what it stemmed out of was I couldn't find something that I actually wanted for my own car. You know, back then my friends and I were driving like, 240s and, cars like that. And it's just
ultimate
like
hot boy car?
Yeah, exactly, right? But like I couldn't find something, like I've always been pretty technical, so like I cared a lot about suspension. My friends just wanted to be, slammed and have a good time. But I wanted something that would like not be super harsh, would have good like reduced NVH, would be comfortable, but also wouldn't cost $1 million. And at the time there really wasn't anything in that space.
Yeah, you just have the two extremes, right?
Yeah, it was either super cheap stuff or even not so cheap, but I'll just say it like Japanese stuff, but it was also kind of harsh. Or you had the really nice like European brands, and especially when we were younger, it was just kind of out of reach. So I was like, why does it have to be this way? Because I understand kind of what's going on in the shock even back then conceptually. So I was like, I'd like to take a crack at it. And that's kind of how we started.
So you guys are a small shop in Northern California.
Yeah.
I guess let's talk about the design philosophy. You don't build dampers for every single car, but the Corolla specifically. The base Corollas come with a twin tube damper. Obviously, the Marizos get a mono tube that's much more expensive shock and better, but still not perfect. How did you guys design your damper kit for this car? What parts are you using? Are you making the housings in-house? Can you walk me through all of that?
So, I'm sure we'll talk about this more like later on in the video, but or in the interview. But wow,
I break this chair. Yeah, you were saying.
But I mean, we really wanted, for us, like I was really interested in the GRC when it was first announced. So I actually tried putting a deposit on one. I was going to dealerships so early that they were like, what are you talking about? It's like, dude, please, like just talk to someone. I want to put a deposit on this car. Long story short, I ended up not getting one. But I really had my sights on making something really awesome for this car since day one. So we took a completely ground up approach. Like in the past, we'd use maybe some off the shelf components or something like that and kind of optimize and really focus on internals to build for the car. But in this car, I wanted to do a clean slate approach. And as the GRC has a little bit of like a rally pedigree and background, I knew that we'd want this to be an inverted monotube setup. And that was a big part of the project that we did for this. So for us, we knew that after looking at the car, we knew that it was going to be very hard to access either the camber adjustment or the dampers from the front cowl area. And also in the rear, there's no access for the rear dampers. So we literally did everything upside down. So we have upside down rear shocks, we have inverted monotubes, and also on the table over there, we have some upside down camber plates that you can adjust from below as well. So like a lot of this was all new to us and for the car, but it was like a great, excuse, if you will, for us to do a deep dive. So I mean, just to speak a little bit more on that, like we have personally spent about like 6 months straight just developing what we had to get to this point. Maybe even, actually no, it's probably been about a year. So it's been a long development process, but it's really pushed us.
So before we get into the actual construction of the damper kit and some of the technical bits of it, you guys spent a lot of time developing these cars, obviously customer cars, you've worked with the Speed Academy folks. What are the inherent deficiencies? Mark and I talk about it all the time, that this thing does not ride particularly well, which you've experienced. What are some of the inherent deficiencies that your damper kit fix in a car like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, aside from the obvious, like you can't really adjust the dampers like you would on a normal car, yeah, I mean, the car is like, it was actually kind of shocking how like loud it was in the interior, and then also how harsh the factory dampers were. They don't, in my opinion, they don't really do anything very well. Like they're not compliant, and they're not really good for performance. So it's, I felt like there was definitely a lot of room for improvement. And actually, even the Morizo was a lot better from a performance point of view, but it's also very aggressively damped. So like, if people are thinking they might want to get some Morizo shocks that have like, you know, a more superior ride quality, I don't think they're going to have it.
So let's talk about some basic principles in dampers. You have compression and rebound.
Yeah.
How do your profiles, obviously, you know, we don't necessarily have the internal information of the Toyota's field, but how do you differ that approach in how you control compression and rebound in your damper versus, say, a factory twin tube?
You know what's interesting is we have the factory dampers. Speed Academy is also nice enough to give us the Morizo dampers. We haven't actually dynoed them yet, just because we knew right off the bat this is not what we wanted. So, but I can just tell you, just from like my experience, like, you know, tuning shocks, the let's say the GRC, it definitely feels like there's definitely a lot of ramp up on the high speed compression and rebound, and that's what's giving it that kind of harsh feel.
When it comes to actual spring rates, how did you determine what worked for this car? Was it purely mathematical?
Yeah. So I mean, we've pretty much, maybe if I could talk a little bit more about our beginning, but
of course.
Before we started building any dampers for any customers, we really took like a physics-based approach at first, because like I did not want to just start yet another like, you know, BS coilover company, right? Like I just, because that's what that's exactly what I was trying to get away from, right?
Yeah.
So we spent a long time like just developing like internal physics models and stuff that we validated. You know, my dad's actually, he's a nuclear physicist. So my dad and I worked together on this model, and like he did some crazy math, but he basically helped me to like just come up with an entire model for a vehicle. A lot of it with my input, but also with his like mathematical like validation.
He's smarter than you are, I understand.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
He's a nuclear physicist.
Yeah.
All right.
So, but then like it was pretty wild, because like once I strung together the pieces that like I had studied, and I've taken calc and stuff like that, so I have some math understanding. But like once I got together the pieces and he validated it, he was like, you know, son, I think this is going to work. Why don't you try it out? And then, you know, myself and the team, we built our first set of dampers using the model, and it was just like eye-opening. It just like, bam, like holy crap, this is working. So that being said, we've used this model internally for years, and it allows us to pretty much take any car that we work on, and as long as we take very careful measurements and get the right math set up, we can just tune by frequency. So now I know that on a passenger car like this, and depending on, like for your use case, right? For someone that just wants like a weekend warrior, wants to have a good time.
These are not race cars.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if you are watching this and you have a Corolla, like, it's a race car. It is not a race car.
Yeah, I mean, it's got rear seats. Like, you want to be able to take people around in most cases.
Drive it on the road.
Yeah, so like on a car like this, or like a sedan like a WRX, on that kind of product, we might shoot for around like maybe like 1.95 hertz. Okay. And so that's around what we set up for this car.
So are you running a you're running a stiffer spring in the rear, a softer spring in the front to give it a little bit more rearward rotation still though, correct?
Yeah, so we start off first by trying to build in flat right. Are you familiar with that term?
No, I'm not actually.
So it's the concept where you have a little bit higher rear frequency than you do on the front. Okay. And so it's more about like OEMs pretty much build this into all their suspension packages. So what they want is when you hit a bump, the front has a lower hertz, or which is basically like the relative stiffness of the suspension package. But they'll have a softer frequency on the front, so that when you hit the bump with the rear wheels, the rear is actually catching up. So so if you're an occupant, you're going to feel this like the car is rising and lowering it at the same rate.
Interesting.
So we try to shoot for that first. There are definitely some cars where that just cannot be done with the factory sway bars. The BRZ is an example. If we built in flat ride into that car, it would be terribly, terribly oversteery. So like we can't safely release that.
Okay.
So on those cars, we have to make a compromise. But Hopefully that answered your question.
No, that's actually perfect. But the traditional thought process we've had or been taught by the engineers we've worked with, and my engineering background, is that typically the belief with spring rates is if you have a lower spring rate, you are sacrificing a little bit of body control for technically a little bit more mechanical grip. Then if you raise the spring rate, you theoretically gain some body control, but you lose mechanical grip.
Yeah,
is that a general way that
that's a great point, and for us it really comes down to like the tires that are used. So
interesting. Okay.
So we have a free suspension consultation that we recommend everyone take before they make a purchase, or even before, like just do the consultation. We'll do all this math for you for free.
So we've talked about your basic company philosophy, how you guys picked ride frequency for the car, but when it comes to damping and your actual internals of the shock, other than obviously it's inverted monotube construction, how do you pick oiling paths and how the actual internals of the shock are designed?
Yeah, so for us, we're very transparent about this. We'll use like components that are like catalog items that we can buy from various companies. So as long as it fits the car and it's safe and it does all the things that we want, we'll just go ahead and buy that item because it saves cost basically, right? Because that's less things we have to design and manufacture. Yeah, shock bodies, not the piston, but the shock bodies and then the brackets. Sometimes the top hats. So if there's an option that's inexpensive that we can buy from overseas that looks like it checks all the boxes for us, we will use that. And what do we do with the extra funds? Well, we spend a lot of time developing the internals. So for us, we're really damper people. Like the coilover that you get is really just like the way we package our damper tech and put it onto the car. Because for us, we just need to mount our tech onto the car and then we can make dampers for whatever. So I say that because we spent so much time just trying to, we design our own pistons, we manufacture our own pistons, we spend a ton of time just QCing, the flatness, the material, that we spec for the pistons, the hard anodizing that we use, the shims that we're not just using inexpensive shims from Asia. We've handpicked or manufactured all the required parts to make a really good damper, and that's really what we spend our focus on. So and then on a car like the GRC, we picked a profile that we know has worked on similar weighted cars and allows us to hit the frequencies that we want and get the ride quality that we want.
Before we head to the track, I felt it was ultra important we drove both of these cars on the street. That's really the point of this build. And to a probably vast majority of our viewers, that's where you're going to be spending most of your time, 99% of your time in these cars. So let's talk about how the power feels, how the suspension tuning feels, and how both of these cars drive overall. And I'm going to be doing all of this from inside of the high car because honestly, the drive's going to look the same to you guys. So with that, let's set off with this thing. So power-wise, both of these cars have the same identical power mods. They both have the same engine tune, identical. They both have the same intake. Neither of them have any extra power modifications other than the fact that this MCS equipped car has a cooler. The way they feel versus stock is pretty simple, to be honest. They have the same throttle calibration, which means the tip-in feels the same. It still has the identical drivability as the stock cars had, but you make power basically everywhere and you make more of it. The car still requires you to wind it out. The great thing about this 3-cylinder is it's a car that you have to, or an engine that you have to work. You need to get it into the higher RPMs for it to make more power. It is a more exciting engine than a lot of modern, I hate to say soulless 4-cylinders, but a lot of its competitors in this class. And the tune and the intake just goes that little bit further to give it a little bit more personality. The intake, regardless of how you feel about the way the exhaust sounds on any of these cars, goes a long way in bringing some of that retro, late 90s, early 2000s compact car fun back to it. I don't think this engine sounds all that great, so the intake does add a little bit more induction noise and that turbo whoosh that so many people love in these cars. It does give it that extra bit of character. Exhaust-wise, this car had an AWE. The low car or the Annex car has an MBRP. Neither of them, if I'm going to be honest, sound all that pleasing to my ear. I prefer the tone of the AWE. The reason why this car no longer has it is both exhausts, or really every exhaust I've experienced in this car, drones. Most of the exhaust systems for this car have deleted the valve, so you just get this constant sound of agricultural 3-cylinder all the time. I don't like it. Some people do, though. If you were going to pick one of the exhausts for this car and you really wanted it to be louder, at least as a street car, the AWD or the AWE does a better job having a more high quality tone for what that's worth. Suspension wise, honestly, that's where we're going to see the biggest difference over the stock cars. And in the real world, on the road, over our style of pavement, farm roads, broken pavement, highway expansion joints, the MCS car, the car that I'm in, and the Annex car, honestly, are remarkably similar in the way they ride and the way they feel. And both suspension setups feel much, much better than what you find in the stock car. So as you heard from Grant, the problem with the car, at least stock, is it does a very bad job in dealing with little bumps and big bumps. Basically, the suspension is not particularly compliant. Feels like it has too much rebound. You're always bouncing up and down. There's a lot of head toss. It isn't very compliant on larger bumps either. And look, I have the fortune and misfortune of driving a lot of cars. I've driven every car in this class. Civic Type R, Elantra N, Golf R, the new WRX. None of those cars have the same problem this has with almost too much rebound. When you move to either the MCSs or the Annexes, probably more realistically to most of you guys, what you notice is the car breathes so much better. Even though we're behind this RAV4, overall these bumps that normally really do upset this car, you have none of those issues. It soaks everything up. You can carry more speed as you want to push through the corners as well. These little bumps that I'm going over don't seem to upset the car as much. Yes, you definitely feel them. You feel them, I mean, you'd feel them in anything, but they don't upset the car, and none of that harshness makes its way into your back, which is the big thing. Honestly, roads like this, the road we're experiencing, which albeit is not all that twisty, but it still has some turns, is where the GR Corolla shines, and all the MCSs or the Annex suspension do is make you enjoy this more. You can push on these roads harder. The car doesn't ever sort of beat you up anymore. It doesn't get upset over bumps. And with the more aggressive alignments that both of these cars have, the thing that this car always sort of struggled with is rotation. Now when you lift, the car rotates when you ask it to. Exactly what you want in a performance car like this, which is so satisfying. I always felt like the regular Corolla was sort of dead. This doesn't have that problem anymore. We're gonna go through this corner, signal because I'm a gentleman, go through, lift, back end moves around. It's fun. And regardless of suspension setup you get for this car, from the high versus low, they both do that on the road. So with that, let's remove the subjective and chase just the objective. All right, now it's time to talk to someone who can actually drive. We're going to be talking about the track section of this video. Britt was kind enough to lap both GR Corollas, the low car that we're going to call the Annex car, the high car, the thing behind us, the MCS vehicle. Now, as far as testing conditions go, we ran them both back to back. It was a hot day. While both cars shared the same track conditions, when you look at our actual leaderboard, you could argue both cars could have had better lap times if it was cooler. Both being turbo cars, they don't necessarily like 100-degree ambient temps.
Yeah.
The track itself was a little bit greasy, so there are lots of variables that slow down the overall lap time. There was essentially 1.1 seconds difference between the low car and the high car. The high car being, of course, faster. As far as mathematically where you gain the speeds was essentially in every corner. Walk me through, Britt, how both of these cars drove.
Well, I think the first place to start would be the brake package on this car. That became a very significant factor that gained lap time overall. It complemented the shock package, but there was one corner where it was very obvious to me that the new rotors and, well, whole brake assembly on the front, it was, yes, the splurge assembly on the front. The way that car wicked away the heat between short distance brake zones, so in my mind it's turn 8 and turn 9 on Autobahn South, there's a very short window of time where you're off the brakes and accelerating before you hit another hard brake zone. The feel difference between this car and the white car that we tested was significant going into that second brake zone because this car wicked off the heat a lot quicker. It maintained the pedal pressure It kept it consistent between the two corners more so than the other car. What was happening in that second brake zone with the other car was the pedal became a lot softer just due to the temperature difference between, it spiked the temperature going into turn 8 and then it spiked the temperature again going into 9. On this car, really no difference between the pedal feel. In the other car, it was a lot more travel, it was a lot softer pressure, the brake pedal went deeper. What that did is it killed the confidence, whereas this car is all day long going to have great brakes. So,
how did the other part of this, I mean, they make the same power, right, on a dyno. How did the actual handling of the cars differ? How do they get, through corners? And let's be clear, both cars are much faster than the cars that have been stocked.
much faster.
But specifically on the track as a pro driver, how did the damper package feel different in both cars?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is the high speed bump, meaning when you're spiking off a curb, pretty similar between the two suspension packages. So that would be the most similar between the two. After that, I would say the MCS package felt stiffer overall in a good way. And also the rear shocks were valved in a way, or they felt like they had more rebound and bump at the same time, but it created more stability. In the MCS, that outside rear tire, you could really feel take a set on corner entry, and it was there to hold while you were getting on the power. So the handling, they're pretty similar, but the MCS is just more crisp, I would say, more fine-tuned.
One of the things I'm going to say as well when it comes to the way they both drove is obviously, Britt is a former TCR champion, GT4 driver. Britt is as fast as you could possibly get a regular person in a car.
Well, we can get faster. But yeah. Give me a day.
And to be fair to both of these packages, we didn't tweak a lot when it came to how they drove other than tire pressures. We worked directly with Annex and with MCS to sort of give their precise settings. I didn't want to confuse the variables too much, but you got up to speed in the MCS very, very quickly. The Annex took a little bit longer. As a novice driver, I felt more confident in the MCS setup than I did in the Annex. While the lap time difference, particularly for probably $15,000 worth of part delta, is not a lot, your confidence level as a driver on track is much higher with the MCS. You can make the Annex get to a similar lap time, but I think it takes a higher skill level to wrangle the car, where it's much easier with this high car between the brakes and the higher end damper and the wider wheels to get to that level. I mean, that's at least just my feel behind it. And to be fair to both brands, the MCS sacrifices a little bit of the, as we've talked about already, street livability. You have a lot more NVH. You have the crazy camber plates. You do have a higher spring rate versus the Annex setup. But again, that's sort of your own personal priorities in driving either of these vehicles. The thing I will say, the driving style of the Corolla, at least for me, I'm going to ask you this as well. I find that you get the brakes to rotate the car in, and then you stabilize it with the throttle. Is that basically the dynamic?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you get the rotation with the brake pedal, and then you just crack open the throttle valve, or the throttle plate, and it changes the diff. So the diff is now in acceleration mode. The wheels are locked and rolling forward. That's exactly what you want in these types of cars, where it's more front wheel drive driven.
Yeah, it is a very easy car to drive. And to sort of end this out before we get on the final thoughts, I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong way to do this, to be entirely honest. If you are crazy enough to spend almost $60,000 on a Corolla, is it a better track car than a car that you're spending less than 10 on, in modifications? Yes. But is that necessarily worth it to you? Probably not. Both options I do feel are worthwhile as far as improving a stock Corolla. I think the Corolla, despite its fairly impressive lap time in its base form, is not a particularly enjoyable car to drive on track. And I think that's probably your assessment as well.
Yeah, and I think it was cool how many upgrades we did, because we saw kind of every genre of upgrade that we could choose from.
We did just tires. We did wheels and tires and pads and camber bolts, and then what both of these cars ended up being as well.
Engine power upgrades as well. I mean, the engine power upgrade, it allowed us to run third gear in what was before a second gear corner. And I think that alone is a lot. significant lap time difference, because if you have that low end torque, you don't have to do that extra shift. You don't have to overslow the entry of the corner by going down to second gear. We also did that shifter upgrade, and that quick shifter, which is awesome.
In the low car, yeah.
Yeah, big upgrade for a shifter. Huge upgrade for a shifter. It was cool because before the engine power upgrade, we could use second gear, and that made it clear that, okay, this aftermarket shifter is much better. But with the power upgrade, you didn't even have to go down to second gear in either car. So that simplifies a lap a lot, and it also for sure gains lap time.
All right. So with that, let's head into the final thoughts. Final thoughts on our high versus low GR Corolla video / modification guide. Now, before I talk about anything else, we'll be doing one more GR Corolla video. In that, I will race Mark around Autobahn South. We will be racing for position around Autobahn South course in his FL5 Type R, which has been modified with wheels and tires, brake pads and alignment, and some other fun things, versus my GR Corolla High Build. We'll be racing for position, where we'll finally crown the king of front-wheel drive-based hatchbacks. I also want to say huge thanks to everyone involved in this video. Everyone from Autobahn Country Club who gave us a home to do this. So if you want to do a track day or learn from someone like Britt, go there. Thanks to Britt Casey, our in-house pro driver who's been with us now for years, and he allows us to fully demonstrate what cars are capable of doing. And thanks to all the companies that helped us with this series. People like Ben from Limit Plus One, Wyatt from MCS, who spent a lot of time with me, Grant, who flew all the way out from Annex to show you on camera how they worked on the suspension and some of their goals. Thanks to Graham, the engine tuner in this, Apex Wheels, Bridgestone Tire, and Jeff from Essex AP Big Brakes, and lots of other people. Without them, the series would not have been possible. The GR Corolla is a car that I've had some mixed feelings on, to be entirely transparent. Out of the box, it was not my favorite hot hatchback, and I think our big shootout demonstrated why. Felt like there was some left on the table, and I think what this series has proven, hopefully, is that this car takes to modification exceptionally well. It is a vehicle that if you are clever or wise with the modifications you pick, you can make a better overall car. You will not be sacrificing its street performance and track performance. You can improve both. The low car, which is, albeit still not cheap to do, is a great example of that. The fast roads from Annex do a really good job improving the overall character of this car. They are a very impressive set of coilovers for the money. It improves the ride quality on the street. It improves the approachability and handling dynamics on the track. It now rotates under throttle lift. You can neutralize it under throttle. It has a lot of the damping characteristics of the MCSs without all the NVH that comes from our high setup. It rides a little bit better on the street, and it costs a hell of a lot less money. The MCS setup is very impressive, probably one of the most impressive set of coilovers I've experienced, but they're very expensive, and they do have a little more NVH in the street department, so that's something to factor in. When it comes to brakes, the Essex Big Brake Kit is phenomenal. I shit you not, it is probably the best set of brakes I've felt in any car I've driven. They are exceptional calipers and rotors. They feel better than the brakes on my C8 Z06, which are carbon ceramics. The con is they're expensive and they generate some more NVH. So if you're primarily street driving, they may not be for you. When it comes to wheels, yes, the Apex wheels are gorgeous. They weigh no more than stock. You can get a wider wheel and tire overall. But to do them, they are pricey, and you have to do extended lugs, which on a GR Corolla is an expensive task. Essentially, you're adding a little less than $1,000. The engine tune, honestly, is a no-brainer. It really does wake up this car, and it seems to be quite safe. The oil cooler does a great job on lowering oil temps. But again, it's about what you prioritize in these cars, and I'm not going to say there's a right or wrong answer. Hopefully, you've just taken away what you think may work for you from this series. So that said, thanks for watching again. We really, really appreciate all your support.